In the northeast state of Mexico, on the Azufrosa Ranch, there's a whole system of underground caves, cenotes, and karst springs. The cenotes are essentially just sinkholes, and the deepest one of them all is called Zacaton. The name Zacaton comes from the free-floating islands of zacate grass which move around on the surface with the wind. It was first discovered within the diving community in 1990 by Jim Bowden and Ann Kristovich, who were part of the Proyecto diving group. Exclusive entry and permission to dive was granted by the landowner, and in late April 1990 the systematic exploration of the cenotes began. They appeared to be extremely unusual, as they were highly sulphurous in odour. The water discoloured and tarnished any metal, and it was surprisingly warm, sitting at a comfortable 86 to 96 degrees. After exploring all of the other underground caves, cenotes and springs, the next challenge in the area was Zacaton. But even just entering the water here would prove extremely difficult, with its steep cliffs preventing any kind of easy access. But the hole was full of water, so surely there must be a way in from somewhere underground. And there was. The first people inside Zacaton were Jim Bowden and Gary Walton. They started on a nearby river and dropped down into its current. After finding a passageway almost hidden away under the river, it took them through an underwater cave and led them straight into Zacaton. They surfaced in the cenote, reveling in the fact that they had found a way inside. They tried to find out the true depth of Zacaton by dropping a weighted plumb line, and it hit the bottom at 250 foot. Little did they know that this was actually just a large platform that was protruding out, and the true depth would remain hidden until December 1993, when the team returned to further explore the cenotes. But this time, they had brought with them something that they didn't have on previous dives, and that would be trimix, a mixture of gases which would allow them to dive deeper and for longer without having to worry about narcosis, which is a physiological anesthetic response that occurs in the brain when breathing certain gases under pressure. It can cause divers to feel almost intoxicated, which can easily lead to very bad decision making, which is the last thing you want when deep diving or cave diving or any kind of diving for that matter. They also had with them the legendary diver Sheck Exley, one of the most well-known names in cave diving. He is the first director of the cave diving division of the National Speleological Society. He wrote the book that basically introduced the rules of cave diving, and although he didn't invent it, he is considered one of the pioneers who paved the way. The highest award for a cave diver is actually called the Sheck Exley Award, which you get after completing 1,000 cave dives safely. There are even places named after him, since he has discovered so many new underwater areas. He first began diving in 1965 at the tender age of just 16, but in that very same year he would enter his first cave, and from that day he fell in love with cave diving. Deep down he was a fanatic for diving and broke records his entire life. When members of the group descended into Zacaton and began their deeper dive, they were shocked when they landed on the protruding platform, and they stared down into a seemingly endless abyss. It was at this moment they realized the error that they had made when they plumbed the depths 3 years ago. They jumped off the ledge into the abyss, eager to seek out the bottom, but of course they didn't reach far before having to turn around and start their ascent. The following day, the team returned to Zacaton, excited to find out the true depth, and they would attempt a more accurate plumb. The line just kept going deeper and deeper, past 500 foot, then 800 foot, and even past 1,000 foot, until finally it hit the bottom at a depth of 1,080 foot. The team couldn't believe it was so deep. They secured the line in place and began making preparations for a deep dive. The following day, Jim Bowden dove to 504 foot, and Sheck Exley dove to 721 foot. They were the first in the world to dive this deep into Zacaton. There was something about the cenote that made it unlike anywhere else in the world, and not to mention how safe it felt compared to other deep diving locations. There was no current, the water was warm, and access into the hole was uncomplicated. And so, as the week of diving came to an end, Jim and Sheck agreed that they would return together to pursue the bottom of this giant hole. The following year, in April 1994, the Proyecto team arrived back at the ranch. Jim and Sheck were eager to dive in Zacaton once again, and this time hopefully reach the elusive bottom. 2 days were spent staging the required decompression bottles at their specified depths. These bottles would provide the required gas for their long decompression on the way back up. They would both be completing their dives on individual descent lines, something both of them favoured to avoid contact and potential interference during the very rapid descent. Early in the morning on Wednesday, April the 6th, the team set themselves up on the bank of the nearby river. The team consisted of Jim Bowden and Sheck Exley, along with both of their wives, and Ann Kristovich, who would be providing support as they were all capable divers. Also present was a media crew reporting on the event, and even the landowners. Everybody felt positive and optimistic about the dive, and when they both felt ready, they entered the river and swam together through the 600 foot of passage into Zacaton. They surfaced inside the cenote to an absolutely stunning view. They commented on what a beautiful day it was, and then wished each other luck, and swam to their individual descent lines. The next few moments were spent in silence, as each of the men calmed their breathing and focused their minds. After a brief glance and nod from each other, Jim was the first to submerge himself and start the descent, and Sheck was soon to follow. At around 750 foot, Jim started to slow his descent. This is the depth he had suffered from high-pressure nervous syndrome in a previous dive, but luckily he was feeling okay, only noticing a very slight tremor in one hand, and continued on, successfully reaching a depth of 900 foot. But he was shocked to find out that he had used up far more air than he thought, and he had to stop earlier than planned to switch to one of the staged air cylinders. But to his horror, the regulator broke off from the cylinder valve violently. Jim was left in a horrifying situation, and he would start to panic. But luckily, somehow, during this panic, he managed to get the valve shut, and the only way to survive was to open it and try to force the air into his mouth every time he needed to breathe. This grueling process continued until Jim's next decompression stop, where he switched to the new tanks, which thankfully had a working regulator. Jim felt a wave of relief, but this would be short-lived. As he slowly ascended, making his decompression stops, the darkness turned to light, and he was now able to see clearly. He could see Sheck's line and even saw all of his staged cylinders still neatly packed away. The sinking feeling in his heart was overcome by the confidence that Sheck had gone deeper than him, and that he was probably still below him. Sheck was known to do this while diving, but Jim was still surprised he would dive this deep. On the surface, the support team already knew Sheck was in trouble, and Kristovich had been watching the bubbles of both divers on the initial descent. Jim's bubbles disappeared at 2 minutes, and Sheck's vanished a few seconds later, as they both reached the ledge at 250 foot. Only one set of bubbles reappeared after about 15 minutes, and she couldn't be sure if they were Jim's or Sheck's. Anne Kristovich started diving down and was glad to see Jim, but there was no sight of Sheck, and her heart sank. Sheck's wife, Mary, was on the cliffs watching from above and could notice something was wrong. She headed down to the river, geared up, and headed through the passage into Zacaton. She wasn't too worried at this time. She calmly grabbed an extra stage cylinder and started descending down, where she would see Jim and Anne, but Sheck was not in sight. Now her worst fears were becoming reality. She wrote on a slate that she was going to swim down to 250 foot to look for bubbles, but when she did, she peered over the edge into the abyss and there were no sign of bubbles and no sign of Sheck. At this time, Jim's wife, Karen, had also geared up and entered the water and started descending. She met with Mary at 150 foot. She was crying and just distraught. All she wanted to do was swim to the surface, but Karen had to hold Mary there, hugging her tight for 30 minutes. It was the saddest decompression they had ever gone through. Jim was notified at about 60 foot that Sheck was gone, and he couldn't believe it. He felt himself go numb from the loss, and the remainder of his decompression became a mechanical process with little conscious thoughts. There was no consideration about a body recovery. At that depth, the only man who was really qualified to pull off such a challenge was the one who was already down there. 3 days later, while the team were pulling up the remaining line, Sheck's body came with it. It's rumoured that in his final moments, knowing he was going to die and not wanting anybody to risk themselves coming after his body, he tied himself to the line, knowing that his body would be safely recovered. His death shocked and saddened the whole community of divers. The very man who created safety rules that still stand strong today had succumbed to the thing he loved most in the world. It might seem crazy, stupid, or reckless to do these kinds of extreme dives, and in some cases you might be right. But without individuals like Sheck Exley, who dare to venture into the unknown depths, we wouldn't uncover the mysteries of our oceans or advance our understanding of extreme environments. Their sacrifices illuminate the path for future generations, ensuring that humanity continues to evolve by pushing the limits of what we once thought impossible. Thank you so much for watching, and if you did make it to the end, please consider subscribing, as I'd love to reach 1k. But until the next true disaster, it's goodbye from me.